1,400 Cuban exiles, 72 hours of chaos, one operation that brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear annihilation. This is the Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 17, 1961, American-trained Cuban exiles stormed the beaches of their homeland in what the CIA promised would be Castro's downfall. Instead, they walked into a carefully orchestrated trap that would reshape the entire Cold War. Today, we're analyzing the Bay of Pigs invasion, a textbook example of how intelligence failures, political constraints, and operational blunders can turn a strategic operation into a complete disaster. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this botched invasion nearly triggered World War III. Strategic background. Following Castro's rise to power in 1959, American policymakers watched with growing alarm as Cuba aligned itself with the Soviet Union. The nationalization of American businesses worth over $1 billion and Castro's increasing authoritarian measures convinced Washington that regime change was necessary. The CIA, fresh off their successful 1954 Guatemala operation, proposed what seemed like a proven strategy: recruit Cuban exiles, provide training and equipment, then launch an invasion to trigger a popular uprising. The plan, initially approved by Eisenhower, was based on the assumption that Castro's government was fragile and unpopular. The CIA established training camps in Guatemala, recruiting approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles into what became known as Brigade 2506. These men received training in amphibious assault tactics, guerrilla warfare, and conventional military operations. Meanwhile, CIA operatives worked to establish underground networks inside Cuba to coordinate with the invasion force, Kennedy's inheritance. When President Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited this fully developed. The CIA presented it as a low-risk, high-reward mission with plausible deniability. Agency briefings claimed that Castro's military was demoralized, his popular support was crumbling, and that a small invasion force could catalyze a nationwide rebellion. Kennedy found himself facing intense pressure. The Exile Brigade was trained, equipped, and ready. Canceling the operation would abandon these men and signal American weakness to the Soviets. However, approving it meant authorizing what amounted to an act of war against a sovereign nation. The young president attempted to find a middle ground, imposing strict limitations on American involvement. There would be no visible U.S. Navy support, no American combat personnel, and minimal air cover. These restrictions would prove fatal to the operation's success. Intelligence failures. The operation's foundation rested on fundamentally flawed intelligence assessments. The CIA's analysis of Cuban internal conditions was catastrophically wrong. They underestimated Castro's military capabilities, overestimated popular discontent, and completely failed to account for Cuban intelligence penetration of their operation. Unknown to the Americans, Cuban intelligence services, aided by Soviet advisors, had thoroughly infiltrated the exile training camps. Castro wasn't just aware of the impending invasion, he knew the exact timing, location, and strength of the attacking force. Instead of achieving tactical surprise, Brigade 2506 was sailing directly into a prepared kill zone. Operational planning. The original invasion plan called for a landing at Trinidad, a populated area where the exile force could blend with sympathetic civilians and establish a defensible beachhead. However, Kennedy rejected this location as too conspicuous, demanding a more remote landing site to maintain plausible deniability. The CIA selected the Bay of Pigs, an isolated swampland on Cuba's southern coast. This change fundamentally altered the operation's dynamics. The new location offered fewer escape routes, no nearby population centers for support, and limited infrastructure for resupply operations invasion airstrikes on April 15th. 8 B-26 bombers, flown by Cuban exile pilots, struck 3 Cuban airfields. The attacks, disguised as defections by Cuban Air Force personnel, achieved limited success. While they destroyed several aircraft, including some bombers and fighters, they failed to neutralize Castro's remaining aviation assets. More critically, the cover story quickly unraveled. When the Cuban government displayed wreckage clearly showing American-supplied aircraft, international pressure mounted rapidly. At the United Nations, Cuban representatives presented evidence of American involvement, forcing the Kennedy administration into an embarrassing position. The landing. At 100 hours on April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506 approached the Bay of Pigs aboard 5 transport ships. What they encountered was not an undefended coastline, but a carefully prepared defensive position. Castro had moved quickly following the April 15th airstrikes, positioning artillery units along the likely landing beaches and deploying mobile reserves to intercept any invasion force. More importantly, he had retained operational aircraft, the very planes that should have been destroyed in the canceled second airstrike. As the first wave of Exiles waded ashore, they immediately came under heavy fire from pre-positioned Cuban forces. The element of surprise was completely lost. Within hours, Cuban aircraft began attacking the invasion fleet, sinking the command ship Rio Escondido and the ammunition ship Houston. These losses eliminated much of the expedition's heavy equipment and reserve ammunition. The collapse. By April 18th, Brigade 2506's situation was hopeless. Cut off from resupply, low on ammunition, and facing overwhelming opposition, the Exile force began to fragment. Some units attempted to fight their way to pre-planned extraction points, while others tried to escape into the Zapata Peninsula swampland. Kennedy faced intense pressure from his advisors to authorize direct American military intervention. The Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed using Navy destroyers to evacuate the survivors, while others advocated for airstrikes against Cuban positions. However, the president maintained his restrictions on overt American involvement, fearing escalation with the Soviet Union. On April 19th, after 72 hours of fighting, the Bay of Pigs invasion effectively ended. Over 100 members of Brigade 2506 had been killed, while more than 1,100 were captured by Cuban forces. Immediate consequences. The invasion's failure sent shockwaves through Washington's foreign policy establishment. Kennedy, publicly accepting responsibility for the disaster, saw his administration's credibility severely damaged. The failed operation exposed American covert activities and provided Castro with a powerful propaganda victory. For Cuba, the invasion's failure had profound strategic implications. Castro, previously maintaining some distance from Moscow, now embraced the Soviet Union completely. Within months, Soviet weapons, advisors, and economic aid began flowing to Cuba in unprecedented quantities. Strategic ramifications. The Bay of Pigs failure fundamentally altered Cold War dynamics. Soviet Premier Khrushchev viewed Kennedy as inexperienced and weak, an assessment that would influence his decision-making during subsequent crises. This perception directly contributed to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, as Khrushchev believed he could place nuclear weapons in Cuba without effective American response. For American foreign policy, the failure marked the beginning of a decades-long obsession with overthrowing Castro. The Kennedy administration immediately approved Operation Mongoose, an extensive program of sabotage, assassination attempts, and covert operations against Cuba. These activities would continue through multiple administrations, creating a persistent source of tension between the superpowers. The Bay of Pigs invasion stands as one of the most complete failures in American military and intelligence history. What began as a confident plan to overthrow an unfriendly government became a 72-hour disaster that strengthened America's enemies and weakened its global position. The operation failed because it was based on flawed assumptions, inadequate intelligence, and contradictory political objections. The Bay of Pigs serves as a permanent reminder that in military operations, there are no easy victories. Poor planning, inadequate intelligence, and political interference can transform even well-intentioned operations into strategic disasters, with consequences that last for decades. For students of military history and strategic studies, the Bay of Pigs offers crucial lessons about the importance of realistic planning, accurate intelligence, and clear political objectives. It demonstrates how tactical failures can have strategic consequences, and how a single botched operation can reshape the entire international order. The Bay of Pigs set the stage for an even deadlier confrontation. Click here to learn how this failure nearly triggered nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis.